Hey guys, thought I would record something to kind of go over what we've been trying to learn online in class. You watched a couple of videos before this looking at some things, and really I just wanted to try to wrap it all up and tie some things together for you. So what we're getting into is this section on civil rights and civil liberties, which is technically the start of Unit 3. We had kind of started talking about this before in class, before, of course, we all got to go home for an extended period of time. So I kind of want to wrap some things up all together. So if we're talking about civil liberties and civil rights, you need to be sure that you know what those are. We have two different things for you to cover here, and they're not the same. And part of this is a little confusing because technically a civil liberty are those guaranteed freedoms we have. So if you think about the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to bear arms, all of those sorts of things, those are your guaranteed freedoms. Those are technically called civil liberties, which means the Bill of Rights would make more sense as the Bill of Liberties, but that's what they named it, so we're going to roll with it. Civil rights are the guaranteed protections that are provided. So I want you to think about the civil rights movement with Dr. King, and yes, the civil rights movement started before that, but it's a shared point of reference, so just deal with it. What are they looking for? What are Dr. King and those other advocates looking for in all this? They're looking for positive protection by the government. They are asking the federal government to act to end the discrimination against them, in this case by their own states. So that maybe is a way for you to think about that. So we really have two sections here. One on civil liberties, which is going to focus on the Bill of Rights, and then a section on civil rights that is going to focus on really extending rights to groups that previously, simply hadn't been able to enjoy them. Okay, so you got to be clear on that one. That's a good sort of maybe multiple choice kind of question. All right, so as we're talking about all this during this section, we're really focusing on Bill of Rights for our first section here. So those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, really particularly amendments 1 through 8. 9 and 10 aren't really litigated a whole lot, and we kind of set those to the side for this section. So you're familiar with all of those, right? We just went over a couple of them. Remember that the Bill of Rights was that thing that was tacked on to the Constitution. The big debate, do we need that? If we enumerate a list of rights, are we limited by that? Are there additional rights? All those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it was agreed we were going to add that on there. And very early on, we had the question of how does this list really apply in people's lives? So we get a court case, Barron versus Baltimore. It's on the screen. You can see it. And this case comes out of Baltimore, and the short version is a guy named Barron owned a wharf, which is where ships would come into harbor to unload. The city of Baltimore was doing work and had redirected some water, and Barron's wharf started silting up. Basically, there was sand in front of it, so the big ships couldn't come to his wharf, which means he wasn't making money. And so, being a good American, he sued. And the basis of his suit is grounded in the Fifth Amendment, basically that the city of Baltimore had taken his wharf and his livelihood from him without due process. They hadn't compensated him for that. And so he sues, and he actually wins in the local court, and then the Maryland State Court is going to overturn that, so now he's lost. And so he appeals up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court takes up the case. And this is one of those interesting things, because this is a John Marshall case. We're used to John Marshall sort of expanding federal power, but here he goes a little bit different. What Marshall is going to say is that in this case, the Bill of Rights does not apply. And I want you to think back to, and I probably should have it on the screen, how does the Bill of Rights start, right? Think back to your First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. And so what Marshall does is he looks at the Bill of Rights and he says, this is a list. It's written in the negative. Congress can't do these things. But it's a list that is designed to constrain federal power. So what that means for Baltimore, and for Barron in this case, is that it doesn't apply there. And so essentially the Bill of Rights is understood as essentially your federal rights, and then you have a separate list of state rights. And since Barron had brought his case using the federal Bill of Rights, he had no case because it doesn't apply to the states. Good thing, I guess, for the city of Baltimore. They didn't have to pay him the $4,500 or something that he had initially been awarded. Bad thing for people that cared about rights, but I guess we'll get to that in due time. So the basic understanding from 1833 all the way till basically the early 1900s, 1925-ish, depending on what case we're going to look at, that's how we really understand our Bill of Rights, is that it limits federal power, but your states could, and of course did, act to limit other people's rights. I mean, at this point in time, I think it was Massachusetts still had an established church. So people were taxed for paying for that. Obviously, we're going to look at all the Jim Crow stuff as we go on. But this is one of the reasons why that can continue on. Okay, so the next big thing that comes along in all this is the 14th Amendment. This is the first section of the 14th Amendment. You need to know it. And the 14th Amendment has a number of clauses. And if you remember the context for the 14th Amendment, it's written in, it's one of our Civil War amendments. 13 abolished slavery. 14th was the Citizenship and Rights Amendment. And then the 15th is going to guarantee voting for African American males. It's kind of the shorthand version of it all. But how do we really understand the 14th Amendment? And, very much at the time it was written to extend rights to African Americans, to the former slaves. And so here's some of the parts of it. So let's start here. We have a citizenship clause, right? All people who are naturally born are guaranteed citizenship. We have a privileges and immunities clause, which you're not going to really need to know because it's fixing to get essentially struck out, ignored. It says that no state shall make or enforce any law which abridges their privileges and immunities, basically your rights as a citizen. The due process clause is going to be a key one. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Think back to Barron for just a second, right? Marshall says the Bill of Rights as it's written does not apply because it's a federal restraint. States have their own things. 14th Amendment due process is, as we're going to see, going to be construed as extending that down. So states have to respect your basic rights. And they have to treat their citizens equally, and actually not just the citizens, the people within its jurisdiction. So this means citizens and non-citizens as well. They have to be treated equally under the law. Obviously, the 14th Amendment, we're in the 1860s. We're fixing to roll, obviously, through that whole Reconstruction Jim Crow era, and we're certainly not going to be treating all of our citizens equally. But those are the parts you have to know for the AP exam. You have to recognize particularly the due process and the equal protection clause. Most of us know the citizenship, or even if we weren't sure it was in the 14th Amendment. Okay, so the 14th Amendment comes along, and we, not part of the Bill of Rights, but still in the Constitution. And so now we're trying to figure out, well, of course, how does this really fit into our understanding of rights? And so we get another case, because that's what happens. And these are a series of cases that come out of New Orleans that we sort of sum up as the slaughterhouse cases, because there's a couple of them that are all rolled into one. The facts of the case was that the city of New Orleans had granted a monopoly to a particular group to run a slaughterhouse in a certain area of the city. And as part of this, they had required all the other slaughterhouses in the city to shut down. And so the guys from the other slaughterhouses that lost out on this whole monopoly sued because their livelihoods had been taken away from them. And if we go back for a second, they're looking at the privileges and immunities. No state shall enforce or abridge, right, to lessen, to take away the privileges and immunities. So it's a privilege to ply your trade, to make money. And in this case, privilege doesn't mean like something special, like your senior get to go off campus, but sort of that state of existence, having a job and doing it. And so what's going to happen here is that the Supreme Court is going to rule against the guys who are bringing the case. They rule in favor of the city. And so what this does is it limits, or basically almost negates, I shouldn't say almost, it negates the privilege and immunity clause. Essentially what they said is these guys could still do their trade. They could just go do it for some other, slaughterhouse, like the ones that we've now granted a monopoly to. And this is going to be a big deal because basically what this is going to do for a little while is kind of sideline how we understand the 14th Amendment. It sort of gets set to the side for the moment. But it's going to come back as we get into the early 20th century, early 1900s. Okay. And this is where we start to see things change. As we get into the 1900s, we're going to get essentially a fresh set of eyes on the 14th Amendment. And what does that whole idea of due process and equal protection really mean, and how do we apply it? And what is really in this new, modern, very different America? All right, so what we're going to talk about is something called the Incorporation Doctrine. And this is one of those key concepts you utterly have to know. So the definition of the Incorporation Doctrine is right up there on the screen, right? The Bill of Rights are made applicable to the states to the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. So we are applying the Bill of Rights to the states. So we are going back to Barron versus Baltimore, where John Marshall said this doesn't apply. Now we're saying no, it does. And the reason it does is because of that due process clause in the 14th Amendment. And more specifically, we use a term called selective incorporation. So incorporation doctrine just refers to this whole big process. Selective incorporation is where we're going to start taking little clauses out of particular amendments, and we're saying, okay, now this clause applies to the states. Now this clause applies to the states. Think about the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. That's one clause. Or the free exercise thereof. That's a different clause. And so each one is going to have to be incorporated, and that's our technical term, as time goes on. And there's a whole bunch of cases, and most of the required cases for AP government are incorporation cases. Not all of them, but most of them. So what we're looking at here is a list of the incorporated cases, and hopefully you can see all of that. If not, I won't tag anything. What am I talking about? I'll share that chart with you. And so basically what we're going to say is the First Amendment, which has a number of parts, right? Free exercise, establishment, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, speech. All of that is fully incorporated. So all of those have been applied to the states. So your states have to respect all of your First Amendment freedoms. We say the same thing for the Second and the Fourth. Not incorporated are the Third and the Seventh, and hopefully you remember what those are. And then what you have in the middle there, the Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth, is they have some little bits that haven't been fully incorporated yet, although we'll talk about the Eighth Amendments here, and did we just get an incorporation case for it or not? All right. So hopefully that helps you understand how Barron versus Baltimore, the 14th Amendment, and this whole idea of incorporation all fit together. If not, let me know, ask a question, send me an email, all of those sorts of things. And hopefully this is helpful. Good luck.